was actually about 3 months into my first job as a journalist, and someone rang me up with some interesting information, oddly enough, about a software company. I can say who it is. It doesn't exist anymore. It's called Tetra Business Systems. They did it very boring. They did accounting software, but they were in financial difficulties. Hadn't been made public. So I rang him up and said, "Is this true?" And the answer was a fax injunction. It was a super injunction. It sort of injuncted against publication of any story, but also injuncted against mentioning the existence of the injunction. So I couldn't really, without breaking the law, tell the NUJ. So of course I broke the law and told the NUJ. It was really, it was a civil case involving a private company, and it was a normal business story. It wasn't a national security story or anything like that, but it was really draconian, the way the courts came down. So the hearings were held in camera. No journalists or members of the public were allowed to attend. I was injuncted against mentioning the existence of the case. I had to break that injunction to tell my parents, for example, and the NUJ. Lord Donaldson wanted me to put in the Court of Appeal, he wanted me to put my notebook in a sealed envelope, which, should I happen to lose the appeal, he would open. So I thought, okay, if I do that, I'm going to lose, he's going to open it. So, there was a threat at one point to search my flat, to get a search order, and I ended up sending one of my colleagues, giving him a keys to my flat, saying, anything in there that looks as though it might be vaguely useful, please put in a suitcase and take. So he did, and took it to an undisclosed location. I never knew where it was. The company concerned insisted on serving injunctions and writs and court decisions on me in person, rather than through my lawyer. It was quite aggressive. So I'd come home at night and there'd be a writ server waiting outside. So I used to play this game where I try and avoid the writ server by sneaking through the back garden and climbing over walls, but he caught me. But one day he fallen asleep in his car. So the poor guy stayed out there all night waiting for me. Came and found me at work the next morning.
And how you went through 3 sets of court hearings? Went up to the House of Lords?
Yeah, I went to the House of Lords.
And how long did that take?
That was good. That was, I don't know, about 6 months or something. That was relatively quick.
So you were in court as a journalist, the subject of these hearings, intense scrutiny yourself. You got fined at the end?
Yeah, they wanted to, initially they wanted to put me in jail because I think they were badly advised legally. I had this law firm called Lover White Durant, Miss Dimsdale Gill, and we had an off-the-record meeting between my solicitors and theirs the night before I was due to be sentenced. And they were saying, yeah, we've got a right to send them to jail and all that stuff. But they said, yeah, okay, you can send them to jail, but you do realise if you do, your company will be named in the House of Lords. You're never going to get any good publicity again from journalists. They're not going to write about you in a good light. Do you really want to do this? And we didn't know which way it was going to go. This next day, sentencing, a barrister got up and gave this long speech, which basically consisted of, Goodwin deserves to go to jail because of this, Goodwin deserves to go to jail because of that. And then halfway through he said, but in a gesture of humanity, we're not going to ask the judge to send him to jail. So I didn't need my toothbrush.
That's very interesting because the other case, what's interesting about Goodwin is there have only been a couple of cases from the UK that have gone to Strasbourg. One is Bill's case, and the other is the FT case, the Interbrew case. And in that case, again, the internal process in the UK. There is in section 10 of the Contempt of Court Act, there is a provision that protects sources, but as with a lot of these things, it's qualified. So it's not an absolute right. And in the UK, there's a provision that talks about the interests of justice, and the courts have interpreted that very widely against journalists. So although you sort of think, well, we're fine, when you get into court, they're looking at a completely different world to the one you think should be there. But in the FT case, again, it went to the High Court and then it went to the Court of Appeal. And at one point, there was the possibility that the Guardian, and I think there were 4 other papers involved, the FT, obviously Reuters, the Indie, and the Times. And there was a threat, basically, that if you didn't hand back this document that had been sent, this little brown envelope thing that arrived on a Friday afternoon, which was common, wasn't it, business world, that the court would impose a £5,000 a day rolling fine for each day that you didn't hand back this document. Now, you can all see that for an organisation, a rolling fine accruing every day that you don't do something is a pretty big commercial risk. And that can put quite a lot of pressure between the organisation and the journalist. And actually, one of the things you learn from doing these things is that you need to sort of separate out some of the responsibilities in these cases. So, journalistically, I mean, Bill's told you what he had to go through. Sometimes the journalist has to take a lot of responsibility on themselves, on their own shoulders, because they're the ones who have the relationship with the source. Lots of organisations will have rules about whether you tell your editor the name of the source, because if the editor knows, then the organisation knows. That puts a different light on things, whereas if the organisation can say to the journalist, Bill, tell us who it is, and Bill says, fuck off, I'm not going to tell you over my dead body, at least the organisation can go back and say, well, we don't know, we can't tell you. And I mean, one of the things I learned, again, as a lawyer is don't ever let the lawyer have the document or whatever it is. Because as lawyers, we have duties to the court that are different to journalists. So, actually, if the journalist needs to keep these things, but it can put you under enormous stress and strain yourself. I mean, we've touched on the stresses for the whistleblower, but for the journalist as well, it can be really, really hard. And I think quite a lot of journalists aren't fully aware of how difficult it can be. If the police come to you and say, you did that interview, the anonymous interview that was printed in the Times or wherever with three victims of sexual abuse, we now want to find out who those witnesses are for good reasons, because we want to go ahead and try and prosecute the bad people who did these things, so give us your notes. You're in this moral dilemma in a way, because you're saying, well, this sounds like a good thing to do, it's going to help, maybe get some bad people, but do you hand over your notes? Would anybody hand over their notes in that situation? And the thing is, if you start making moral choices about these things, so this is a good cause, I'll give them my notes because it's a good cause. When the bad cause comes along, what do you say then? Oh no, well I'm not going to, this one's different because I've made a moral judgment. So the practicalities of some of these things can be really tricky.